So I am a Director of Research at the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. My work largely involves what homeowners can do in their homes and on their properties to reduce risk from a variety of different hazards, including wind, hail, wildland fire, basement flooding, and earthquake. And a lot of my work has focused on basement flood risk reduction because it's such a significant driver of losses in Canada. So I've been working on this topic for about 14 years. Well, we're involved in a number of projects, and I have a number of associates that are doing different types of work. Personally, a lot of my work over the past couple of years has focused on building codes, what to do in new and existing houses. I'm currently Vice Chair of the CSA Z800 Basement Flood Protection Guideline that'll be coming out pretty soon. Also, my work involves the role of the insurance industry in reducing risk. We do a lot of work with the insurance industry in Canada and municipalities to identify strategies and tools for reducing risk for all types of hazards. By and large, I would say municipalities are doing a really good job. I find that the staff at municipalities, wastewater, stormwater staff, are extremely knowledgeable. They know what to do, they know what needs to be done. If there are barriers, it's typically not technical barriers being faced by municipalities, but it's a whole slew of risk perception and political issues that may act as barriers to action. Well, so everybody's aware of the potential impacts of property damage, just flooded properties, damage when you think about the damage that you get from basement flooding, sewer backup is particularly concerning because it's raw sewage, untreated sewage that's coming into your basement. It's diluted, but it's nevertheless not treated. I think a couple of things that homeowners may not be aware of is first, just the hassle, the stress associated with dealing with an insurance claim, dealing with contractors, and so on to get your basement back into order, and the time that takes and the stress is something that may not be on people's minds. I think a really important thing also is loss of sentimental, irreplaceable items. So a lot of people use their basements for storage. They store their photo albums, their backup hard drives, their kids' grade 1 papers and that sort of thing. And when that's gone, it's gone forever. You can't replace that stuff. Everything else can be replaced. Maybe it'll take you a few years, maybe you'll have to make an insurance claim, but it can be replaced. But the sentimental items are often a key thing that people are worried about. And another thing that people often forget or may not realize how important it is the potential impacts that a flood event can have on your insurance coverage. It can change your insurance coverage, even if you haven't been flooded, but you're in a high-risk neighborhood. That's something that you really should keep an eye on. I'm not sure of a specific timeline, but I think it's usually much longer than people expect. And I personally have overseen a number of projects for basement flood retrofits, and I've dealt with homeowners who've had their basements in a disheveled order for several months, if not a year. And then even going through the retrofit process to install these measures, it can take quite a bit of time. Well, I would say in most newer subdivisions, the houses are built and the subdivisions are designed much more carefully when we're thinking about extreme rainfall events. I think the biggest barrier, I don't think there's any question, most municipalities will be aware that they have high-risk areas. Some of the big barriers that are ongoing that we face all the time is what homeowners have to do to reduce risk. They have to get the excess water out of the municipal sewer system. And that takes time and money and conscientiousness on the part of the homeowner. They have to be aware of the problem, and that can be a hurdle. And just the cost and the technical difficulty of, say, implementing infrastructure programs in existing neighborhoods, in many cases is prohibitive, and there will be a certain amount of risk that may never actually go away. Sure. Well, in fact, I would say that private side flood subsidy programs are already the norm in most of the big urban municipalities where they've had repeated flood problems. You'll find that they have subsidy programs, and even in the past there have been provinces that have helped partially subsidize things on the private side. So it is the norm. Some of the things that you might want to keep in mind with subsidy programs is that they tend to focus on wastewater system related flooding and less on all of the other various potential causes of flooding that a homeowner might face. Things like a sump pump failure is not always incorporated into these programs. So if you're an isolated home with a sump pump failure, lock grading, retrofitting lock grading, various issues may not be covered by these programs. And I would hope, as we move forward, we can find new programs, new incentives, new drivers that can help homeowners with the comprehensive set of flood risk reduction measures. Well, I mean, there's a number of things. It all depends on who you're talking to. I would say, by and large, the insurance industry is pretty well aware of flood risk issues, especially when we're talking about the difference between, say, coastal and riverine and urban, overland flood versus sewer backup, et cetera. They figured this stuff out quite some time ago. And what insurers are doing is they're underwriting this stuff much more carefully, taking in new information wherever it's available, and looking at it in that fashion. In terms of governments, I think the insurance industry has also been pretty active in raising awareness of the topic, and we've seen a number of initiatives come our way in the last few years. Significant funding available for municipalities for flood risk reduction. Often those programs are focused on infrastructure for river flooding as opposed to basement flooding. But there are other programs, for example, the National Building Codes. There are several initiatives, including the CSA Z800, that are oriented toward understanding how we can change building codes to accommodate basement flooding specifically. So I think we're moving in the right direction, and there's been a big change in the last couple of years, especially at the federal level, that has intensified focus on this problem. So on the positive side, there have been a number of initiatives in place or put in place that are starting or well underway, as I just mentioned, looking at building codes, looking at design standards, et cetera. But I think cynically, generally, across Canada, we're probably on the road to more intensive damage. And that's because we already have so many people already located in these high-risk areas. It's very difficult to mitigate risk in these areas. You can mitigate it to a certain extent, but at some point it becomes cost prohibitive. And another movement that we've seen in many, especially the highly urbanized parts of Canada, is a movement toward densification, affordable housing, so encouraging homeowners to use basements as living space, because you can't have a big sprawling house on a big lot anymore. Lots are smaller, so people want to live in the basement. And another thing is movement in the land use planning circles toward affordable housing. So municipalities, for example, in Ontario can no longer say that you can't put a basement apartment in your basement. And so as we continue to densify, this will affect risk. And I would say that this is an inevitable course. There are other factors that are driving the change in behavior and how we use homes. So the very least we can do, and the most important thing we can do, is to make sure that those homes are designed so that they're safe, especially when we're talking about tenants living in a basement apartment with all of their worldly possessions potentially exposed to basement flood risk. Well, that's a difficult question. It really depends on your property. And I would say if there's one thing, so if you have been flooded in the past, I would say the most important thing to do is you've got to figure out how that water came into your home. because that will affect what measures you do to reduce risk. So sometimes it may appear as though you've had sewer backup, but it could have been groundwater, it could have been storm sewer backup. And I think the most important source of information on that, the first place to go is to your municipality. Read the brochures that they've issued. If you can get somebody on the phone, if you can take advantage of their programs, often the programs will involve very intensive investigations, that sort of thing. It's very important that that's done and that you understand how the water came in your basement before you do anything. For the average homeowner, I would say two very, very simple things that you can do. One, I mentioned before, the importance of sentimental, irreplaceable items. The basement is not a good place to put photo albums and backup hard drives. Keep that stuff up on the top floor. And also, once a year, talk to your insurance broker, your agent, your company. Spend 10 minutes with them understanding what you're actually covered for and whether or not your coverage has changed and what coverages you could purchase at potentially a relatively low price. I think those are two things that almost any homeowner can take home with them. Well, this may not relate. So for sewer backup, basically the only thing you can do is either put a backwater valve in or install a sewage ejector system, which is sort of complicated. But in a general sense, I would recommend for a homeowner or for somebody looking at a new house, keep an eye on that sump pump. That's a big vulnerability. Does it have a power backup system? When's the last time it was maintained? Very simple things can affect the flood risk from a sump pump. One of the big causes of sump pump failure is that float gets stuck on the side of the pit or on the pit cover, and that's a very simple thing to look at and fix, and could potentially save a lot of trouble. Well, I've personally dealt with several homeowners through our home retrofit program. So we have a showcase program, we retrofit a house, and we've done about 8 so far on basement flooding. And these homeowners, by and large, in a few cases they haven't been flooded, but they've been flooded. You know, and as I mentioned before, it's extremely distressing to go through a flood event. These homeowners are typically more engaged, they're willing to let us go into their home. And we've always had a very positive response with our flood retrofit program. People feel much better after the measures have been installed. So my experience is that you know, the homeowners that we've dealt with have actually done something. Some homeowners do nothing even after they've had a flood event. It's important to do what we can to get all homeowners who've had flooding to do something. Some of the flood experiences that I know of people having were from very simple things, like the sump pump failure caused simply by a float sticking, something that could have been solved in a few minutes or seconds by any homeowner. And so after that sort of event, people pay much more close attention, not only to their sump pumps, but also to their home plumbing in general. So I would say those people that I've dealt with have been highly motivated, and they've installed the measures. I would say for anybody who's gone through that process and installed the measures, the next most important thing is maintenance. So we're finding through one of our projects that's looking at the performance of basement flood protection measures over time, starting with backwater valves, is that these are not foolproof items, especially when they're retrofitted. They're difficult to install properly, so they need to be maintained, they need to be checked. And I would recommend, some companies are now coming online that will come into your house for regular inspections at relatively low cost and maintain that valve. And I would recommend anybody who's gone through this process to initiate a regular maintenance schedule. So my experience with the homeowners that we've dealt with is that once the measures are installed, they become much more relaxed. Again, these are highly motivated homeowners. And many homeowners, the problem is that many homeowners will be flooded and they'll hear the statistics. They'll listen to the radio after a storm, and they'll hear somebody talking about a 100-year return period event or something that was way beyond the design system, the design capacity of the city system. And they'll take that as a cue that this is a rare event and maybe they don't need to worry about it. And so those people already have a low sort of concern about the problem. But those homeowners that I've dealt with repeated flood events, getting those measures in, it does make a big difference to their quality of life. From the programs or the houses that we've retrofitted, I'm not aware of anybody having another major flood event, which is positive, but we haven't done that many. But I do know personally somebody who in a city in Southern Ontario had a major flood. They went through the city's subsidy program, they installed a backwater valve as recommended, and they were flooded again. And their feeling was that, well, these systems are not effective, I guess there's nothing I can do. So that's not necessarily a positive outcome. But I think that highlights the need to really understand what's causing the flooding. It's quite possible that in this home, it wasn't sewer backup. It could have been seepage. It could have been a storm sewer backup that caused the flooding, and putting that backwater valve in didn't necessarily solve the problem. Well, so education is for sure important, and it's important to get good information out through as many channels as possible. That's certainly an important thing. Another thing I really think that we should focus on, and will become an increasing issue, I think, for home inspectors, is installation of this stuff via codes, regulatory requirements. And even though we're not going to be getting necessarily the older subdivisions right away, over time, as we redevelop, for example, many cities now say, if you're redeveloping your property, if you apply for a building permit that affects your sanitary sewer lateral, then you need to put a backwater valve in. I think in the long run, this is what's going to really help mitigate this problem over time. And then homeowners definitely need to be educated about how to maintain those systems and make sure that they work properly. Well, I would say the home purchasing process is probably your best time to start thinking about flood risk. And if you can educate yourself using whatever information is available, are you thinking about buying a house with a reverse slope driveway, with a window well that's right at the surface in a low area? These are things that might throw up a red flag during the process and may affect the purchase decision. Another thing you can do was, we haven't really defined what type of flood we're talking about, but there are different types of there are different types of flood mechanisms that potentially affect people across the country. So you have urban flooding, sewer backup, which roughly might affect anybody in a highly developed urban area, especially older urban area. You have river flooding and coastal flooding as other major causes of flooding. There's lots of information available in most provinces to identify whether or not your house is in a river floodplain. And I would encourage people to think about looking for that information before they buy a house. Many municipalities will have published environmental assessment reports or engineering studies looking at their sewer systems and potential ponding issues in their jurisdictions outside of the floodplain. If you can track that information down and think about that when you're buying your house, I think that would be a very important thing to do.